So thank you everyone for joining us today, and welcome. And I think for those of you who don't know me, my name's Colin McIver. I'm the co-chair of the Bristol Law Society ED&I committee. And today I'm delighted to welcome Imam, Qazi, partner at Foot Anstey, and Faiza, Mukith, CEO of the Islamophobia Response Unit today for our Islamophobia Awareness Month webinar. You may have noticed already that this session is being recorded. So just so everyone's aware, if you haven't attended one of our webinars before, they get recorded and put on our YouTube channel, so you have a chance to watch it back after the session. And we will also be sharing the slides after the session, so no need to be scribbling down notes as we go through it. We will send both the recording and the slides a few days after we have this webinar, so hopefully by the end of the week. If you've got any questions, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat, and we will ask the questions at the end of the talk. We've also already had a few questions in advance, so thank you for those of you who have already sent in your questions. I noticed as people were coming in, not everyone has used their full name or have used their initials. If you could, when you're signing up and signing in, just let us know your name, and you can drop BLS a message directly if you cannot change your name, just so we can make sure that everyone who is supposed to be here is here, and we haven't let anyone else in that shouldn't be here. And it also just helps us to keep track of who's joining us on a regular basis. So that is all from me on behalf of BLS as our welcome, and you'll hear from me again when we get to the Q&A. But I'll now hand over to Imam to start us off. Thanks.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you for the kind introduction. So if you could go on to the next slide. So about a year ago, I did a presentation on the Islamophobia Awareness Month. The slide before that, I think. The Islamophobia Awareness Month internally at Foot Anstey. So I'm a partner at Foot Anstey in the head of the Islamic Finance Sector. And we did an internal look through Islamophobia to talk about what it is, how it manifests itself, and ways in which we can assist in overcoming the problems of Islamophobia in our firm and more broadly in our society. So this year, so Islamophobia Awareness Month is a month that happens in November each year. So to kind of step things up for this year, what we decided to do was to reach out with a sense of collaboration to the Bristol Law Society. So huge thanks to them for agreeing to host this session this time to enable colleagues from Foot Anstey to also join, but also more broadly other lawyers in the Bristol legal community. And we've had a few other friends from further afield joining today as well, which is great to see so many of you. I guess the other difference between the sort of presentation last year and the one this year is that we have a more eloquent and informed speaker in the name of Faiza, who's joining us, and she'll be taking us through the bulk of the presentation. And the presentation has got essentially two main parts to it. So the first part, we'll be looking at Islamophobia and Islamophobia Awareness Month, just kind of putting that into some context, and some kind of feedback and thoughts that we've had and reflections from the event last year was that we ought to think or give a bit more time towards the sort of tangible outcomes and things that we can all do to help and move the dialogue forward. So the second part of this presentation will be focused on something called the Islamophobia Response Unit, of which Faiza is the CEO, and she can tell us all about that and hopefully give us some case studies and some hints and tips on how to get involved and some tangible things that we can all do to hopefully make a difference. So we go on to the next slide. So in terms of myself, as I mentioned, partner here at Foot Anstey, been living and working in Bristol for the last 20 odd years, and as well as my sort of fee earning partner role, I'm also head of our diversity and inclusion action group, which has a broad remit, as you can imagine, and that has led me to get involved in a number of different things, such as the Association of Muslim Lawyers, which is a national organisation, and also working with Coralie and her team at the Bristol Law Society on various initiatives. And we're joined by, as I mentioned, Faiza, who's CEO of the Islamophobia Response Unit, previously a solicitor at Simmons in London, and I've known Faiza for a little while, but the first time I met her actually was yesterday. So up in London, we were kindly hosted by the Simmons London office to do the official launch of the Islamophobia Response Unit with some esteemed speakers and a very engaged audience. That was a fantastic event and a great opportunity to get to meet Faiza and the team at Islamophobia Awareness Month and Islamophobia Response Unit. So next slide, please. So as I said, I'm going to hand over shortly to Faiza to talk about the main topics that we want to cover today. The first question is, what is Islamophobia? And I thought I'd just give my own sort of personal reflections on that. So for me, I think what's most interesting is the sort of intersection between racism and Islamophobia. So I kind of grew up so my family came over as refugees to the UK, and I was born just soon after they came over in the mid 1970s, and we came via a kind of a refugee camp in Austria, and then we landed in a council estate, kind of an all-white council estate. So growing up in the sort of late 1970s, early 80s, it was quite a different environment to what it is now, and racism was a very big thing. So the National Front, as it was then known, was very much a kind of part of daily life, and it was kind of a bit of a struggle sort of getting through. But getting through sort of day by day, week by week, things kind of you get used to some of the aspects of racism, but also I think what happened is there was definite improvement, both at a community level and also at society level and governmental level, and also through what was happening in schools as well. So there, through the I guess there were lots of allies to join the fight against racism in school. So I noticed, for example, in primary school, when things happened, things were kind of brushed aside as it's just you're just playing around, don't take it too seriously. But by the time you kind of got to secondary school, things were taken much more seriously, and there was a conscious effort to tackle racism, and it had real sort of positive effects, and that sort of top-down approach, as well as a sort of a change in societal recognition of the evils of racism, did help to, it obviously hasn't eradicated it at all, and there's still lots of racism in lots of different forms, which has peaks and troughs and spikes for different reasons, but there was a clear shift in terms of the general perception of the evil of racism, if you like. And then I guess what's happened more recently is the sort of slightly more nuanced challenge of Islamophobia, and how the dial is moved so that there is there has become almost a how would I say it, a sort of a common understanding that it's almost okay to attack, I guess, from an intellectual level, the religion of Islam and what it stands for and the impacts of it, which is fine because obviously there is room for debate, but the way in which the debate is held and the language that is used can be even more damaging than than some of the more kind of physical impacts of Islamophobia that has arisen. And I kind of like to think of as kind of an example for me is the phrase that's often thrown around, which is that okay, we accept that not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim, aren't they? And that kind of complete fallacy has kind of unfortunately sort of taken root in the mindsets of lots of people, and that translates into lots of sort of very negative outcomes. And I think we are kind of making some really good progress through lots of positive interaction that's being held at lots of different levels across workplaces, through government organisations, and through lobbying, and through actions we're taking with media, holding them to account, etc. To kind of move the dial away, and I think we are making some real positive progress in maybe understanding that Islamophobia is as bad a thing as racism is. So I think there's lots of lessons we can draw from that. I think I'll probably stop talking from now and pass you over to Faiza, and I'll just add in a few more thoughts as we go. So Faiza, what is Islamophobia, do you think?
Thank you so much for that, Imam. Can everyone hear me okay? I have 2 thumbs up, great.
Yeah.
So what is Islamophobia? We do have a definition which will come up in a few slides, but if Claire, if you wouldn't mind just moving to the next slide. These are the types of instances of Islamophobia that we deal with at the Islamophobia Response Unit. So usually people tend to think it's verbal and physical attacks. It's the outward Islamophobia that usually people might see on the news or people talking about it on social media. But there's so much more to it. So we have structural Islamophobia, exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, and stereotyping. And some of the cases that I talk about later on in this presentation will touch on some of these examples. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about some key stats, which is really important, and it can give you an example of how far-reaching Islamophobia is. So recently, we've seen a massive rise in hate crime, and according to Home Office data this year, there were over 155,000 hate crime reports recorded by the police in England and Wales. So that's a 26% increase compared with previous years. In year ending March 2022 of this year, where the perceived religion of the victim was recorded, 2 in 5, so 42% of religious hate crime offences were targeted towards Muslims. And Muslims only make up less than 5% of the entire population in the UK. So you can see here how disproportionate this is, and highlights how Islamophobia continues to be an issue in society. Imam, I think you wanted to speak some more about this slide.
Yeah, I think we need to move on to the next slide to see the pie chart, which I think is what you're referring to, in terms of the disproportionate impact of religious hate crime. Yeah, just one thing I wanted to mention was the sort of the Jewish, I guess, quarter of that pie chart, which is very significant also. And I would say it's kind of a couple of things I would draw from that. Well, 2 or 3 things. One is that I guess the impact of religious hate crime on the Jewish community is also very profound, because even though that proportion is obviously smaller than the Muslim proportion, they make up a much lower number of the UK population. So you could say that the impact on them that they're facing in terms of anti-Semitism is just as bad, if not worse, than what Muslims are facing with Islamophobia. A lesson we can draw from that, though, is that the, I guess, experience and sophistication with which the Jewish community have, I guess, taught us all about anti-Semitism, and they've been very good at recording and making sure things are reported fully, whereas the journey for for Muslims and for Islamophobia to be recorded has been quite a difficult one. So it's only relatively recently we've managed to get the police commissioners to agree to have specific recording of Islamophobia events. So I think there's something we can learn, from our Jewish colleagues and friends in terms of that data gathering exercise and how powerful that can be. And then the third point I would just make on that is that, with my hat on as I'm on the board of the Association of Muslim Lawyers, we actually work quite closely with the Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. We've hosted work together with on a number of joint seminars and presentations looking at issues which I guess apply to both Muslims and Jews, and how we can kind of work together to solve some of those. And the concept of allyship works both ways, and those of us sort of Muslims on the call, we can benefit from allies from our colleagues, but we can also be allies to others facing discrimination. So that could include the Jewish community, or it could include other I guess minorities on grounds of race or sexual orientation or religion that are being discriminated against. We've all got that role to play. So I just thought I'd give that kind of quick reminder. Sorry, back to you, Faiza.
Thanks so much for that, Imam. If we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So looking at Islamophobia, structural Islamophobia, these are just some stats that we put together to look at employment discrimination, which is very important to me because by way of background, I am an employment solicitor, and some of the things that I've seen already and some of the things I've experienced can really emphasize how much of an issue this is. So the first bullet was talking about a study that was carried out by BBC in 2017, which showed that people with non-Muslim sounding names on their CV were 3 times more likely to be offered an interview, which is shocking. And I have friends who have actually decided to change their names slightly on a CV to see if they might get a job, which isn't something that any community should have to do. With the second bullet point about Muslims receiving less pay. So a further study was conducted and resulted in confirming that Muslims receive 13 to 21% less pay than their white Christian counterparts. So there's a real issue where Muslim women are subjected to the triple penalty because they are Muslim, they're also women, and oftentimes they may be of a specific ethnic minority group as well. So that's a fact that we've discovered. The third bullet point talks about how 18% of Muslim women were unable to find a job when wearing a hijab. Again, we've had several clients at the Islamophobia Response Unit approach us with such issues and talking about how they have taken their hijab off because they thought that they would stand a better chance getting a job. And the final point was about questions. So a stat we found of 1 in 8 Pakistani women were asked about their marriage and family aspirations during the job interview in comparison to 1 in 30 white women who were asked such questions. And unfortunately, again, this stat I can relate to, and I too have been asked about marriage and family aspirations at the stage of an interview, which isn't something that any woman or anyone should have to deal with when looking for a job. If we can move to the next slide, please. So coming back to the definition of Islamophobia, we've got 2 here. So the first one is by the All-Party Parliamentary Group, so APPG, on British Muslims, which is Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And the second definition we have here is Islamophobia is an exaggerated, irrational fear, hatred, and hostility towards Islam and Muslims perpetuated by negative stereotypes resulting in biased discrimination of Muslims from civic, social, and political life. The definition that's commonly used in the UK is the APPG definition, and it's actually been adopted by several councils and local government across the UK. And we do hope that many more will adopt this definition over the coming months. The APPG definition highlights the fact that Islamophobia manifests itself in the same way racism does. So it highlights that it's not just Muslims who suffer, but it is also all those who are perceived Muslims. And we've seen this in our cases at the IRU, where oftentimes there is a stereotype that all Asians, for example, are Muslims. We've had clients who are actually of Sikh faith and have contacted us to say that they've been abused on the street, their beards being pulled and their turbans being ripped off their head because the perpetrator thought that they were Muslim. So this is why we use the APPG definition, and we hope that other councils and the government actually accepts this as a definition of Islamophobia. Next slide, please, Claire. So what is IAM? So Islamophobia Awareness Month, we're actually coming to the end of the month, thank God we had this webinar in time, is a campaign founded in 2012 by a group of Muslim organizations to raise awareness of Islamophobia. So it aims to raise awareness of Islamophobia in society, as well as showcasing the positive contributions of Muslims in the UK. Our vision is to see Islamophobia Awareness Month campaign widely recognised and supported every year. And I think it's absolutely amazing that Bristol Law Society have taken this time to have this webinar and show you all what Islamophobia Awareness Month is about. We actually want to see a society that is understanding and inclusive and free from all aspects of the spectrum of Islamophobia. Next slide, please. So this year's theme was about tackling denial. And I did want to ask the audience, if you're allowed, I think you could probably put some points in the chat on what you think an example of where the denial of Islamophobia may exist. Coralie, am I allowed to ask this question if people can engage?
Yeah, people can use the chat function to respond.
Yeah, I'll give a quick less than a minute for anyone to just pop some answers in there and how they think an example of where Islamophobia might be ignored and in what areas this may exist. Imam, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I have lots, but I think kind of personally what I've
Got some answers coming in.
Bit of introspection is that I think maybe I've been guilty of it myself, in that,
yeah,
especially coming from, I guess, how I explained that sort of journey from about experience lots of racism and then more recently experiencing Islamophobia. You kind of, when you see Islamophobic things happening, you almost kind of dismiss it as that's just kind of somebody being racist, and then you don't really realise or think that actually the reason for that is the Muslimness of me or a family member that's like specifically being attacked. So I think that's something maybe hopefully historic, but it's becoming more understood now from a personal perspective. I'm sure there's more.
Agreed. I can see some answers coming in. So someone said social housing, World Cup in Qatar, which has been a huge issue. A lot of people will say it's in your head or perceived and not real. Agreed. We have so many desperate clients that come to us with those types of concerns. Excusing inexcusable comments by our previous Prime Minister. Yes, I'll touch on that in a second. The media not recognising or acknowledging Islamophobia, recruitment in the workplace, schools, justice system, Conservative Party, airport, immigration, customs. I was just in America last year and we almost get ready to go to that section where they're going to call us aside. And it's actually a thing in my family where we leave like 5 hours earlier because we know we might actually get stopped at the airport and our bags checked. Workplaces, yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions. Everything is absolutely correct. So just talking more about the theme of tackling denial. So I think the key spaces that we see them in, and which some of you have mentioned, is the political spaces. So Islamophobia within politics is commonly ignored and dismissed. And someone also mentioned the Conservative Party, which is true. And we've had our own former Prime Minister refer to women wearing the niqab as letterboxes in an article for The Telegraph. So it is difficult for us to question or actually accept that Islamophobia might be a real thing and the government to accept it as a definition. And how can we ask for equality exists when our own Prime Minister can say such things, which is one of the difficulties that we are having as a community. In social spaces as well, that's another area in which the denial of Islamophobia may exist. So we have lots of figures who are given the spotlight. For example, Katie Hopkins, who is a spotlight figure on social media when it comes to Islamophobia, and a lot of it is glamorized now, and people are being supported. And if you see the fan base of these individuals who just are talking horrible things about Muslims and Islam generally, and they are given the platform. So that's where we can see denial of Islamophobia, and media spaces as well, which is something that someone's already mentioned. If we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just a quick introduction on the Islamophobia Response Unit, which is the charity that I manage. So we assist people who have been subjected to Islamophobic hate crimes, hate incidents, and discrimination. We provide a platform for victims to confidentially report their experiences and receive legal support, basic emotional support, and access to other referral agencies. So one of the key reasons why the IRU actually came into existence in 2017, it became formal in 2018, was for data collection and monitoring. So one of the key questions that the people who had the idea to create the IRU was, well, we know that Islamophobia exists because we experience it, but how do we prove that it exists and take it to Parliament and lobby the government to accept a definition of Islamophobia? So one of the key things that we do is data collection and monitoring. And since the opening of the IRU, we've received over nearly 1,500 reports, and we've only been around officially for about 3-4 years, which is a staggering amount. And it's with that data we're able to produce articles and submit to, like, for example, hate crime reports, to help produce informed policies on Islamophobia. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, IRU Data, so we've had 1,200 reports with over 500 hate crime, over 300 discrimination, some reports that are both hate crime and discrimination, and I'll give you an example of what that might look like, and around 200 cases that are not within our remit. Next slide, please. Oh, apologies. So yeah, so the types of cases that we deal with include hate crime cases. So that's all the horrible stuff that you might see on the news. So verbal abuse, physical assault, criminal damage, online hate speech and harassment. In terms of our discrimination cases, we deal with workplace discrimination, so unfair dismissal, less favourable treatment, lack of prayer room facilities in schools and public services, and we also advocate for uniform policies to accommodate Muslim students as well. So those are the types of cases that we deal with at the IRU. In terms of how people can report to us, we have an online report which is on our website. We have a helpline that people can call, and email as well. And we also get referrals from other organisations. So we're working very closely, for example, with Citizens Advice, Victim Support, Advocate, a few other pro bono networks as well that refer clients onto us as well. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you 3 case studies, and then hopefully we'll stop hearing me ramble on. So case study 1 was about a Muslim employee who suffered discrimination and differential treatment by her managers. Now, in this case, the client decided to wear the hijab. So she never used to wear the headscarf at work, and then she decided to after she had completed her pilgrimage and realized a difference in treatment. So her manager would organize team bonding activities and not accommodate her religious needs, would make comments about her, and justified his actions by saying that because she was the only Muslim employee, you know, they were allowed to make fun of her. This same manager also prevented her from getting a pay rise despite the years of service she provided to the company, and she raised a grievance. Unfortunately, this case had to be taken all the way to the employment tribunal, at which point bringing a discrimination claim on grounds of religion is always quite difficult to bring in court. Races are slightly easier. But on this case, which is a lesson that I'd like to share with everybody, we actually had a non-Muslim white colleague support this client as a witness. And she came out and provided a statement to say that she heard her manager talk about this client as a Baghdad bomber. So there were lots of horrible comments that were being made about our client, and it was a non-Muslim colleague that stepped forward as an ally and provided a witness statement, which turned the entire tide of the case, and thankfully she won. So that was one of the cases that we dealt with. Next case, please. So this case, again, it's a workplace discrimination case. It was a Muslim employee. So I mentioned to you guys that we deal with hate crime cases and discrimination, and sometimes we get both, which is always very horrible to deal with. So this case, we had a client who was at work. She was verbally abused by her manager, and she was also physically assaulted by her manager. Her manager actually threw a chair at her and had a real issue with her wearing the headscarf and dressing modestly. This client ended up suffering from a heart attack and sustained or suffered from a long-term health condition. So this client, we supported. She came to us at the very early stages. So we actually assisted her throughout her grievance process, the appeals, and we managed to take this case all the way to the employment tribunal final hearing. And thankfully she achieved the outcome that she desired. So that was another horrible example of the cases that we deal with. And finally, on the third slide, this again, a workplace discrimination case study. So a client who actually worked for a public service body and was subjected to discrimination by her colleagues. So this is a typical issue that we deal with, where colleagues think it's okay to joke with other colleagues. So it was workplace banter, which turned into harassment. And she complained of her prayer mat being slashed at work. And this client complained of how she would fast during the month of Ramadan, which is a holy month that Muslims take part in. She'd be fasting for 15, 16 hours a day, and she'd have her food in a container in the kitchen. And when to break her fast, you'd see that her food had been replaced with bacon, so things that Muslims can't eat. So that's the type of harassment she experienced, and it got so bad to the point where this client was actually almost suicidal. And the reason why she got to that stage was because she had been telling her managers that this is what she was experiencing, but her managers dismissed it as workplace banter. So this case is actually still currently being heard at the employment tribunal. And we're actually still going on with the case. I think, yep. So in terms of volunteering for the IRU, I think one of the questions that we actually had, which we'll go over at the end, was how to be an ally. And I think it's really important that you hear about the services like IRU and other organizations that are doing similar to work to us and actually volunteering. So I know a lot of people here are lawyers and have legal expertise, and the backbone of the IRU are our volunteers. We have around 60 caseworkers and lawyers who provide us their assistance in their spare time. So we actually, when a case gets reported to us, we'll determine the remit, we'll produce a case file, and then we'll allocate it to a legal supervisor who's then paired with a caseworker. So in terms of the time, it's not as enduring, it's not too difficult from a capacity perspective. So we are always looking for lawyers with various expertise. I think a lot of the work that we do, it doesn't necessarily need you to be an employment lawyer or a crime lawyer. A lot of the work that we do is very much common sense based. It's just helping our clients review a grievance document or putting a letter together. So those are the types of ways in which you can get involved. We also are seeking pro bono support from law firms. We actually have engagements in place with around 8 law firms that provide assistance from various angles. So a lot of the assistance that we provide our clients is pre-litigation. So when it does get litigious, we then hand it over to our partner law firms to take a case on. So that's something that that's another way in which people can get involved with the IRU as well. Next slide, please. And then getting involved with IAM. So these are the ways in which you can get involved with the Islamophobia Awareness Month, the campaign. I know we're at the end of the month, but it doesn't mean that we can't continue talking about IAM. You can become a supporter on their website, follow us on social media, attend one of our partner events or host your own event, and keep the conversation going. As I mentioned, we'll be around every single year. So I hope that Bristol Law Society and everyone who's attended do go off and host their own event as well next year. And I think we've got final slide. And if anyone's got any questions or comments, feel free to email me, which is on the slide here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Faiza. I just mentioned from a sort of financing perspective where we are, been taken our involvement with Islamophobia Awareness Month quite seriously. So we are following them on social media. We've registered as a supporter, and obviously hosting this event and making sure it's recorded has been part of the action that we're taking as a firm.
Amazing. No, it's always great to hear. Coralie, do we have any questions that we wanted to go over?
Yeah, we're starting to get questions through on the chat, so I'll let on the Q&A, sorry. So I'll let people have time to add any additional questions. But I'll run through some of the ones we received in advance of this session. I think the key theme for the questions posed in advance is really around allyship, what non-Muslims can do to support their Muslim colleagues. So the first question is, what are the best ways for me as a non-Muslim to support Muslim colleagues and friends as someone who does not have personal experience of Islamophobia?
Okay, maybe I'll start with that. So I think, as I said, we've kind of covered a few ideas, but I would perhaps sort of break it down into 3 different areas. So the first one is on a personal level. So, you know, Muslims are human beings, and just that kind of friendly personal interaction with your Muslim colleagues and Muslim friends goes a long way, just to making life easier for them and for yourselves and for everyone. So there's no I know it's no rocket science there, but it's just having those genuine sort of personal relationships and friendships with your colleagues of whatever faith, and just having that as an ethos in your firm can really help. I guess the second point is on a professional level. So where you are, for example, in a meeting, or maybe you're leading a meeting or leading a presentation, be conscious of who's in the room with you, and think about all of the characteristics from a sort of diversity and inclusion perspective, and just make sure everybody gets a fair voice, and recognise that some people would need more encouragement to bring their points forward than others. And I think if you just have that approach, I think that can be really powerful, especially for those of you in supervisory roles. I think that could be really useful. And then I guess the final one is the more sort of the practical kind of call to action that Faiza mentioned, in terms of getting involved in things like the Islamophobia Response Unit, volunteering your time, or looking at other pro bono activities that you can get involved in terms of supporting the IRU or other really good charities. And I think there's lots of opportunities to do that.
Thank you, Imam. I think there's some good questions now coming into the Q&A, so I'll just pick up the first one. It says, if we can find the space for it, I want to try and re-establish a quiet room at my workplace, but it would have to be multi-faith or non-faith room. First part of the question is, are there issues for Muslim users if we were to accommodate requests from other faith groups for some form of the iconography to be displayed in the walls? And the second part is, should we expect such requests from Muslim users?
That's quite a good question. So I've dealt with sort of that sort of particular issue at both firms I've worked at in Bristol. And from my perspective, I think first of all, from a for those listening sort of from a Muslim background, or maybe working in a firm that doesn't have any kind of provision, first thing I would say is if you just go and speak to HR or anybody sensible in your firm, you will get they will be willing to listen and have this kind of conversation. So answering this type of question now is exactly the sort of thing that employers are willing to have. So let's kind of be confident in that. To answer the kind of the specific questions, I think, a kind of a multi-faith area, I think always works better than a Muslim prayer room. So it's something that can be used by different people for different purposes, is useful. And there have been some examples in the past where you've had a room which is kind of a medical room also used as a prayer room, and that can be a bit tricky. So I think there needs to be a bit of common sense around how many people are likely to use the room and when they're likely to use it, to make sure that it is something that can be a service that needs what it's designed to do. In terms of iconography, I think I would just kind of keep things as neutral as possible, and there wouldn't be any sort of Muslim request to have any kind of iconography in the room. So I think it's best just to keep that plain neutral. I don't know, Faiza, have you had any specific examples of these types of issues arising?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and it's really nice that people are being proactive about it and actually considering what would be helpful. So yeah, just on the iconography part, we usually just keep it plain. The firm that I used to work at had a beautiful prayer room, and it was just plain. And there was a partition in the middle so that if men wanted to pray on one side and women prayed on the other side, which is one of the requests I think Muslims usually have. And just a washroom as well, because we do ablution, and you might see Muslims sneaking off to the bathrooms to do ablution and having a designated space for that. Though I know it's sometimes a bit of an ask because it requires a lot of plumbing, but having something like that in place will really show that you value your Muslim colleagues and are providing for them in every respect. I think one of the key things as well, if you do manage to pull off this prayer space or a faith room, is just having a guest book. And sometimes when you get people writing their comments in there, you can actually have tips on how to improve as well. And when you see your guest book being filled up with people saying how grateful they are, it actually gives you more confidence to say, well, I've done a good job. And that's one of the things that my old firm did, which they really like. I've left the firm. It's been about almost 4 years now, and the senior partner still emails me about oh, by the way, this person wrote this comment on the guest book about the prayer room. So I was like, oh, that's great. Good news. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, Peter. I think we've got another question, right?
Yeah. So we've got, in terms of Imam's comment earlier in the session about how there is a societal perception of all terrorists being Muslim, how can we as allies help to educate people that this isn't the case? I've read a lot about this in the context of the media using different terminology, where, for example, there is a white man who has committed a terrorist act, but is not even described as a terrorist, and the disproportionate amount of reporting itself, and much more negative terminology used if someone is Muslim. So I guess the question really is, they've used an example there, is how can we as allies help to educate people that this isn't the case?
I think that education is kind of everyone's responsibility. So just calling things out and having discussions about these issues as they arise, and being confident doing so, I think can go a long way. There are also sort of more practical things you can do in terms of holding the media to account, and there are some organisations that are specifically doing that. But I think if you have a broader range of people, maybe writing into the newspaper or to the BBC or to whoever it is, so it's not just a few kind of usual Muslim voices that are complaining about these things, but it's a wider group of people, pulling out this sort of unfair or distinction, then I think that could be really powerful.
Faiza, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, I think Imam's covered it pretty well, but
yeah, he has. Just to add to that, you can just complain to IPSO. I think it stands for Independent Press Standards Organization. So they have a responsibility to hold media outlets to account, and we do see that disproportionality where we see Muslims being termed as something as compared to a non-Muslim being defined as something else. So we as an organization do actually complain to IPSO very regularly, which is something that I would encourage the general public to do as well, because it shows that you are calling them out for what they're doing and hopefully not standing for it. I think that's the key thing. When you see it, to say something about it, as opposed to just noticing it and not doing anything, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. So next question is, post-Brexit, what is the possibility that British law will be changed to allow Islamophobia to continue indirectly?
That's quite a tricky question. I think I would answer that by, I guess, referring to, I guess, the European Human Rights Convention, and how there are sort of protections through being part of Europe that has helped with discrimination. I guess with Brexit, the UK has its sovereignty to decide what it likes, and I think that just comes down to, I mean, I don't think there'll be kind of a specific move to allow Islamophobia, but you're right, there could be some sort of indirect messaging or policies that can have that effect. And I think it's just, I guess, at a political level, holding our politicians to account on that, and being mindful of when elections come up, what are our candidates standing for, what are the parties standing for, and having those considerations, not just economic competence, for example.
Thank you, Imam. Faiza, do you have anything to add to that one? I know it's quite a tricky legal specific one, but
no, it is. I think it might be hard, and it depends on what kind of mailing list everyone signs up to, but there are plenty of organizations out there that are lobbying certain changes to the Human Rights Act, for example. Like, we've seen changes or attempts to change legislation which aren't favorable for Muslims and ethnic minorities, and it's being mindful of what's going on as well in the government. So when watching the news and reading about it, there are actually lobbying organizations out there that are preparing templates that you can write to your local MP or your local councillor to argue this in government for you. There are several MPs out there that have actually been trying to get the government to adopt a definition of Islamophobia, which is one of our primary goals. And once a definition of Islamophobia is accepted, then we can hopefully see legislation to back that up as well. I think someone's asked a question relevant to my answer. So does the IRU have Muslim politicians and or peers as members? We don't have any members per se. We actually pride ourselves in being independent of everything. So we don't actually affiliate ourselves with the government, the police, or local councils. We are strictly a legal advice clinic, so to speak. But we do have politicians who have approached us to say, give us a thumbs up and saying the good work that we're doing, and have approached us for data. So APPG, for example, have recently contacted us for information about some of the case studies that we're dealing with, so that they can take that information and argue it in Parliament. So those are the types of interactions we have had in the past, but not members per se. That hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, I think that answers that question. And then next one I have, again, is quite a tricky one. It's, why has there been a more sympathetic response to Ukrainian refugees compared to refugees from some other countries, for example, Afghanistan, Syria, etc.?
Yeah, I guess we could say kind of, this whole kind of presentation has answered that in a way, because it's a manifestation of Islamophobia, I would argue. And if you bear in mind the sort of definition of Islamophobia as I guess a specific type of racism, I think that kind of comes very clearly to the fore. And it is a real problem. So I know there's a very good charity in Bristol that helps all refugees, and they've had a specific request from donors that they will make certain donations or provide certain facilities, but it should only be for certain types of refugees. It should normally be the Ukrainian versus the other sort of non-white. So yeah, it's definitely an issue, and I think the reason for it, I think, is I guess, problems of racism and Islamophobia in society. And Faiza, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to that. I think the reality is that in every time in history, there's always been some kind of scapegoat, and the world's always needed someone to blame. And unfortunately, Muslims are it right now, and I'm not going to shy away from saying that. And it is a fact, and it is a reality. And so sometimes when there is a disaster going on in the world, or war or anything like that, unfortunately, that mentality still applies, where if that country, whether it's Afghanistan or Syria, and we know it's a Muslim country, does it fit with the narrative of what's going on? So in terms of having the scapegoat mentality is always going to exist. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's been a different response to Ukraine refugees as compared to refugees from a Muslim country.
Okay, and I think we have a third question. In your opinion, what role do the police actually play in helping with Islamophobia?
I guess I was going to ask that question to Faiza anyway, just in the context of the work that the IRU do. I guess it's in the kind of on the private sphere, if you like, in terms of from a legal approach. So where you're presented with cases that you can handle. So all of the case studies I noticed that you put forward were kind of employment law cases. I guess there must be lots of examples where there has been sort of criminal damage or violence perpetrated against your clients, and so I assume you kind of pass those over to the police, and how receptive are the police to those referrals, and what's your I guess experience of the police with that? I think that kind of deals with the question that I think Zahir was raising.
Just adding to that as well. No, that's okay. No, just adding to that, I think it's a really interesting question here, because we've had the good side of the police helping, and then the really bad side of the police helping, because sometimes we have cases where clients have come to us, they've reported it to the police and not heard anything back. And so it's our responsibility at that point to intervene and contact the police. And when we don't receive a response, then whilst we're also helping a really traumatized client, we're also submitting a complaint to the IOPC about the police's conduct. And oftentimes we find where the police that actually shows up at the scene of the crime, whatever narrative they produce at that point is the one that they run with. And if that person at that time has no awareness of what Islamophobia is, or the definition of Islamophobia, it might just be listed as a crime. But our goal is for it to be actually recorded as a religiously aggravated hate crime, which is why, I mean, the stats are showing that there has been an increase. And yes, we have the 26% increase. But at the same time, our stats are showing that not enough of these hate crimes are being recorded appropriately. And it's the responsibility of the police to build the case. So whatever evidence they gather and how they put forward the narrative for it to then go to the Crime Prosecution Service for a perpetrator to be convicted, a lot of the times our cases don't go that far. Usually they will say there's not enough evidence to prove that this was religiously aggravated. So I think there is a real responsibility on the police generally to understand more about Islamophobia. We've actually rolled out training with different police departments and told them about what it is that we do, and hopefully we're listed as a third-party reporting centre. We always encourage our clients to report it to the police, because if it's a crime, it's a crime. The police will need to deal with it. But at the same time, we need to make sure the officers on the ground are educated and are aware of Islamophobia as well. I hope that answers your questions here.
Yes, so I think that is all we have time for, but I think we've actually covered all of the questions. The specific questions we didn't cover, I think covered by either the talk generally or further questions, where there was some overlap between the questions anyway. So just want to say thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to Imam and Faiza for speaking today and providing us with a great talk and lots of tips and things to think about and take away now. And hopefully everyone else will have found it really useful as well. As I said at the beginning, we will circulate the recording and the slides afterwards, and I think it has your contact details on it as well, Faiza. I think if anyone wanted to follow up with you directly on that. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you.
Thank
Bristol
you.
Law
Take
Society.
care.